Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation of how to respond to the challenge of China. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Joe Nye. A member of the Harvard University faculty since 1964, Joe Nye has served two presidents, beginning in the Carter administration, focusing on nuclear weapons. In 1993, President Bill Clinton appointed him chair of the National Intelligence Council, which coordinates all 16 intelligence agencies. He was next appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Joe returned to Harvard to become the dean of the Kennedy School. He was an informal advisor to the Obama administration. He's the author of 15 books. Upon retirement from the Kennedy School, he was named University Distinguished Professor. He's just as busy in retirement. He continues writing, speaking engagements, and he remains active in international security affairs. And we are thrilled that Lexington's own Joe Nye has agreed to be with us today. Please welcome Joe Nye.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's always a pleasure to talk to Lex Vets and my own hometown. I'm going to talk about China and how we should respond and whether history tells us any lessons that we can use for this. But as you mentioned, because of the events in Ukraine, which we knew nothing about when you and I first planned this session months ago, I'm going to, at the end of my speech, make some link to the current events and China's role, as well as what's going on with Russia and China. But let me start at the beginning. And that's the view that China is going to surpass the United States as the world's leading power. And Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has his so-called China dream, which includes that idea that China will be the leading country by the 100th anniversary of Communist Party rule in 2049. Now, is that possible? Is Xi Jinping going to accomplish this or not? Nobody knows the answer to that, including Xi Jinping. For one thing, Chinese growth may slow down. There's some people like historian Hal Brands and Michael Keckley who say that China was not going to escape the so-called middle income trap. They've raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but they may not reach the level of a very rich country. Another problem could be that China gets inadvertently into some sort of a war, with perhaps between the US and China over Taiwan. Or another problem is there could be a financial crisis. In other words, any projection out to China's dominance in 2049 is full of uncertainties. And that leaves a real problem for the policymaker, which is how should we respond? What's the appropriate way of responding? Now, very often what happens is as policymakers wrestle with a dilemma like this, they turn to the lessons of history. They say, well, what can history tell us about how to respond to a major situation like this? And it's a useful way to start as long as you don't think that history has exact lessons. Mark Twain is alleged to have said that history never repeats itself. At best, it merely rhymes. And anytime a policymaker tries to replicate events of the past or treat them as a guide to current policy, he or she has to realize that the future is always different from the past. What my colleague at Harvard, Ernest May, a great historian, used to say is whenever you think that this situation is like the past and you're starting to use it as a guide to the future, take out a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and on one side, put a list of the things that are similar, and on the other side, put a list of the things that are different. Then you may begin to be able to use history in a useful way, but it's certainly not an exact blueprint or a guide exactly to how you should work in policy. What I'd like to do this afternoon is turn to three historical stories that we are telling ourselves in Washington these times, and ask what they are telling us about how to respond to China, the rise of China. In some ways, there was a famous Italian literary figure, Luigi Pirandello, who wrote a play called Six Characters in Search of an Author. I'm going to talk this afternoon about three histories in search of a policymaker. And the three stories that are most prevalent in Washington these days are the idea of what's called a Thucydides trap, or the idea of a new Cold War, or the idea of sleepwalking as in 1914. So let me explain each of these in turn, and then conclude with what I think we should do, and then turn finally as a coda, so to speak, to how this relates to the current situation in Ukraine. Now, the idea of a Thucydides trap is based on the notion that we're going to repeat something that's happened many times in history. When a rising power confronts an established power, there's a very high probability that that will go to war. And Thucydides, who was the chronicler of ancient Greece, argues that the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart, was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And that is what we call a Thucydides trap. So as we look at the situation today, we notice that China is rising, America's established power, and the issue is, will we fall into a Thucydides trap or not? Will we see a war between the US and China? As I mentioned earlier, not everybody believes this is likely. As I talked about Hal Brands and Michael Beckley, they think China is actually a peaking power, which will reach a plateau. But more people than not in Washington these days take the opposite view, that China's rise is inexorable and that it will provoke a major challenge to the United States, and that will involve us in a Thucydides trap. Now, my Harvard colleague, Graham Allison, has tried to quantify the cases of when a rising power has challenged an existing power and it's led to war. And he's looked at all the cases, he thinks, since 1500, and finds that 12 out of his 16 cases have led to major war. On the other hand, you can't take these percentages too seriously. I mean, if you believed him, this would be 3/4 chance of a war between the US and China. But it's very unclear what constitutes a case historically. For example, in the middle of the 19th century, Britain was the dominant power and Germany was a rising power. In the middle of the continent, in the middle of the century, Germany fought 3 wars, or Prussia did, to unify Germany, and Britain stayed out of it. So these were opportunities it could have had to have nailed down Germany or knocked down Germany when Germany was weaker, but they didn't. And eventually, of course, they went to war in 1914 and World War I. But should that be one case or 2 or 3? That ambiguity makes one a little bit wary of trying to quantify cases from history. Moreover, even if you do treat it as one case and look at World War I, you have to note that World War I was not simply a case of Britain, the established power, responding to a rising Germany. In addition to the rise of Germany, World War I was caused by the fear in Germany of Russia's rising power, as well as a fear of growing Slavic nationalism. And in that sense, it was not as simple as the Thucydides Trap model would make you think. Today's power gap between the US and China is also much greater than that between Germany and Britain, when Germany had passed Britain already in industrial strength well before 1914. If you measure the US and Chinese economies at exchange rates, which is a sensible way to measure them when you're talking about imports and exports, so forth, China's economy is about 2/3 the size of the United States. That makes it a larger challenger than we, the United States, have faced in our history before, but it doesn't mean that they're like Germany, which had already passed Britain by 1914. And that, in addition to that problem with the analogy, the Thucydides Trap, or that story, there's a question of whether Thucydides told the story exactly right when he first described it. The famous Yale historian Donald Kagan argues that Athenian power, in fact, was not growing at the time that the war broke out. Before the war broke out in 431 BC, the balance of power had begun to stabilize. And it was Athenian policy mistakes that made the Spartans think that the war might be worth the risk. Athens' growth had caused the First Peloponnesian War earlier in the century, but then a 30-year truce doused the fire. Kagan argues that to start the second and disastrous Peloponnesian War, you had to have a spark land on one of the rare bits of kindling that had not been thoroughly drenched, and then continually and vigorously fan the flames because of poor policy choices. In other words, the famous Peloponnesian War that gives us rise to this story of the Thucydides Trap was caused not just by impersonal forces, but by bad decisions in difficult circumstances. So what should policymakers or people like President Biden do today, and what should they conclude are the lessons of histories for how the US should respond to rising China? If the Peloponnesian War was caused in part by the rise of Athenian power, it was caused equally by the fear that it created in Sparta. American policymakers may not be able to control the rise in the power of China, but they can affect the degree of fear that it creates in Washington. Exaggeration can mobilize domestic support, but if it's excessive and leads to miscalculation, that would be the ultimate Thucydides trap. In other words, metaphors from Greek history can serve as useful precautions, but they become dangerous if they give us a sense of historical inevitability. So the Thucydides trap is a good cautionary story, but it is that, a cautionary story, not a blueprint for a policy of how to respond to China. Let me turn now to the second story that's very popular in Washington that people are telling themselves, and that's the idea that we're entering a new Cold War. Now, the rhetoric of Cold War and talking about a new Cold War can be very useful to policymakers and political leaders who want to mobilize domestic political support. But the metaphor has been advocated by some historians as well. Some say that looking back, we'll see that President Trump launched a new Cold War of intense competition without shooting. But I think that is not accurate. Trump was not the sole source of the problem. Trump was like a little boy who comes along and pours gas on a smoldering fire and it bursts out into dramatic flames. But in fact, it was China which lit the original fire. After the Great Recession of 2008, China came to the view, or Chinese leaders came to the view, that the United States was in decline. And they abandoned the very cautious policies that a previous leader, Deng Xiaoping, had recommended, which was to hide your strength and bide your time. And they changed policies quite dramatically under the new President Xi Jinping. What they did is they built artificial islands in the South China Sea. They used economic coercion on Australia. They abrogated their guarantees of freedom in Hong Kong. And on the trade front, they tilted the playing field by subsidies to state-owned enterprises and coercive intellectual property transfer. Trump rather clumsily responded to these measures with a tariff, but unfortunately it was clumsy because it included penalties on our own allies as well as on China. On the other hand, he was correct to defend against Chinese companies like Huawei, whose plan to build a fifth generation telecommunications network inside the US posed a very real security risk. Now, some people in Washington then began talking about a new Cold War and a general decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. But it's a mistake to think that we can decouple our economy completely from China without enormous economic costs. And that's why the Cold War analogy, or the story that we're entering a new Cold War, misleads us about the nature of the challenge that we face from a rising China. In the real Cold War, the Soviet Union was a direct military and ideological threat, but the US had almost no economic or social contacts or interdependence. With China today, the United States has $500 billion in trade and millions of contacts in the social sphere, ranging from students to tourists. China, moreover, has done something that the Soviet Union never did. We used to talk about Marxist-Leninist approaches. Well, China has changed this to what you might call a market-Leninist approach. They have learned how to harness the creativity of markets along with authoritarian communist Leninist type of party rule in a way that the Soviets never mastered. So in that sense, China can't be contained in the same manner as the relatively weak Soviet economy was during the Cold War. Some more countries have contact with China as a major trade partner than they do with the United States. And while they want an American security guarantee, they do not want to break off economic relations with China. So in that sense, the idea that we could get our allies to treat China in a Cold War fashion as we did in the Soviet Union is not very likely. Moreover, the United States and its allies are not threatened by the export of communism in the same way it was in the days of Stalin or Mao. There's less proselytizing than during the Cold War, and few people today are taking to the streets or jungles in favor of Xi Jinping thought with Chinese characteristics, as the saying goes. Instead, the problem we face with the challenge from China is a challenge of a hybrid system of economic and political interdependence, which China can manipulate, support authoritarian governments, and influence opinion in democracies to prevent criticism of China. Witness the way China punished countries like Norway when the Nobel Prize was granted to Liu Xiaobo, or South Korea when South Korea put in a missile defense program, or Australia after Australia criticized China for the origins of the virus that we're suffering from now. In each case, China used its economic access to its market as a way to punish these countries for political events they disapproved of. And because China has become the leading trading partner of more countries than the US, the idea that we can decouple from China is not plausible. Partial decoupling on security issues, like the Huawei case that I mentioned, is useful, but we're not going to be able to decouple the economies the way we did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Moreover, there's another aspect of interdependence, which is different from the days of the Cold War, and that's what you might call ecological interdependence, such as climate change and pandemics. These ecological interdependencies follow the laws of physics and biology, not politics. And then when you're dealing with issues of this type, the transnational ecological problems, You can't solve them by acting alone or just in a bilateral fashion. In the book, most recent book I published called Do Morals Matter, I argue that we have to learn to use not just power over other countries, but we have to learn to use power with other countries. Meaning that if the US wants to do something about climate change so that Florida or the Chesapeake Bay or indeed the Charles River are not all underwater by the end of the century, we have to do it with China. China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And we're behind them, but we have to cooperate on that or we both will suffer. China will suffer too. If the Himalayan glaciers melt and agriculture dries up in China, they'll have a terrible problem as well. So at the same time that we're disputing with them over, let's say, artificial islands in the South China Sea, we're sending naval ships to contest the freedom of navigation operations, we're going to have to cooperate with China simultaneously on issues like climate change or the next pandemic that comes along. This is not at all like Cold War containment, in which we were able to isolate the Soviet Union. In a sense, I've argued that what we see in the current relationship with China is something like a three-dimensional chess game, in which you have to play on three boards that are stacked on top of each other vertically, and you have to notice the relationships up and down as well as sideways. And if we treat the relationship with China as pure military interdependence, the first chessboard, and ignore the second chessboard of economic interdependence and the third chessboard of ecological interdependence, we're going to lose. If you play a three-dimensional game on one dimension only, you fail to win. So in that sense, we have to have a much more sophisticated strategy than saying we're simply going to replay Cold War I. It's not that simple. And if we let our minds be trapped by the story that's so popular in Washington today, that we're entering Cold War II, we may have the wrong strategy. We may think that it's another two-dimensional game rather than what we're really facing. That brings me to the third story that can be told about the relationship and is sometimes used in Washington these days. The fact that the Cold War metaphor is counterproductive as a strategy doesn't mean that there's not a possibility of another Cold War or even a hot one. We may get there by or inadvertence or miscalculation. Henry Kissinger, for example, has warned that the appropriate historical metaphor for our current period is not 1945, but 1914, when all the great powers expected a short, sharp third Balkan War, and instead they got a world war that lasted 4 years and destroyed 4 empires. Now, what happened in 1914? Leaders paid insufficient attention to changes that had altered the process of the international order that had sometimes been called the Concert of Europe. One important change was the growing rise of nationalism. In Eastern Europe, Pan-Slavism threatened both the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires, each of which had large Slavic populations. Nationalism proved to be much stronger than socialism when it came to bonding working classes together, and stronger than the capitalism that bound brokers together. So nationalism and rising nationalism was one issue. The second cause of the loss of moderation in the early 20th century balance of power was the rise of complacency about peace. The great powers had not been involved in a war in Europe for 40 years. There had been crises in Morocco and Bosnia, Balkan wars and so forth, but they've been manageable. However, the diplomatic compromises that resolved these conflicts also caused frustration. After there is a tendency to ask, why didn't we make the other side give up more? Why didn't we press harder? Many leaders believed that contributing to the loss of flexibility in the early 20th century, international cause of loss of order was Germany's policy, which was ambiguous and ambitious, but vague and confusing. And there's something terribly clumsy about the way the Kaiser of Germany played his cards in that period. On the other hand, you could see something similar to that in Xi Jinping's China dream. There is a rise in nationalism in China today, which Xi is using. And as the Chinese rate of economic growth slows down, they're using nationalism as the glue that provides the legitimacy that holds the Communist Party in place. And this has given rise to a very nationalistic set of policies by Xi Jinping. I mentioned a few of them earlier, as well as what's sometimes called wolf warrior diplomacy, named after a rather chauvinistic Chinese film that shows a Chinese standing up to the Americans. And that type of aggressive foreign policy is sometimes called wolf warrior policy. Now, policymakers today must be alert to the rise of nationalism in China, as well as the populist nationalism we have here at home. And combined with the clumsiness of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, a history of standoffs and compromises over Taiwan, and clumsiness in efforts to reassure Taiwan, the prospects for inadvertent escalation exist. Now, the analogy to 1914 has been made by a British historian, Australian historian, actually, Christopher Clark, in a book that he titled The Sleepwalkers. And here's how he summarized this situation in August of 1914. Said, once catastrophes occur, they impose on us, or seem to do, a sense of their necessity. But Clark then goes on to say that in 1914, the future was still open, just. For all the hardening of the fronts in both Europe's armed camps, there were signs that the moment for a major confrontation might be passing. What does that tell us then, that little story from history, about where we are today in responding to the rise of China? It tells us, I think, that a successful strategy must protect against such a sleepwalker syndrome. In 1914, Austria, the declining Austro-Hungarian Empire, was fed up with upstart Serbian nationalism. And notice that declining states, such as Austria was, often take higher risks and lead to greater crises than rising states. That's analogous to the situation today, where Russia is declining power and China rising power. But in any case, the assassination of an Austrian archduke by a Serbian terrorist was a perfect pretext for an ultimatum in 1914. Before the Kaiser left for his vacation in July of 1914, he decided to deter a rising Russia and back his Austrian ally by basically giving Austria a blank check. And when he returned in August and found the way Austria had filled in the blank check, he tried to retract, but it was too late. Now, that, as I said, may have some lessons for us to think about, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk in terms of the situation in Ukraine. In any case, the US hopes to deter the use of force by China and preserve the legal status quo of Taiwan, which China regards as a renegade province. And for years, our policy has been designed to deter Taiwan declaring independence in a unilateral way, and also of China using force to take over Taiwan. Our policy has been no declaration of independence and no use of force, and then the two sides should bargain with each other. But even if China eschews a full-scale invasion and merely tries to coerce Taiwan with a blockade or by taking an offshore island or two, or if there's a ship or aircraft collision that leads to loss of life, all bets are off. If the US reacts with freezing of assets for China or invoking the Trading with the Enemy Act, the two countries could slip quite quickly into a real or a metaphorical Cold War. So I think the third story of the three that are circulating in Washington, the story about the dangers of sleepwalking, is the one that needs to be taken most seriously. Let me conclude not then by saying what we shouldn't do, but what we should do. if you ask what's the right way to respond to the rise of China, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has argued that the objective for great power competition with China is not defeat or total victory over an existential threat, but what he calls a managed competition. A sound strategy requires us to avoid demonization of China, instead see the relationship as a cooperative rivalry or competitive coexistence with equal attention to both parts of the description. If China changes for better in the long run, that's a bonus, but it can't be the sole basis for our policy. So a successful American strategy, to conclude this, has 8 components. It starts at home and must be, first of all, preserve our democratic institution that provides us the soft power of attraction and provides us many allies, and we don't have to coerce them to be allies. Second, we should invest more in research and development that maintains our technological advantage. Third, we should maintain our openness to the world rather than the retreating behind a curtain of fear. Fourth, we should restructure our legacy military forces to adapt to technological change. Fifth, we should strengthen our alliance structures, including NATO, Japan, Australia, and Korea. Sixth, we should enhance our relations with India, and the Biden administration has upgraded the so-called Quad, in which India, Japan, US, and Australia meet to coordinate policies. Seventh, we should strengthen our participation in supplement the existing set of international institutions that we created to set standards and manage interdependence. And eighth, we should cooperate with China where possible on issues of transnational interdependence, such as climate or health. Now, in the near term, given the assertive policies of the Xi government, it looks like Biden will have to spend more time on the rivalry side of the equation than on the cooperative side. But if we avoid ideological demonization and misleading Cold War analogies and maintain our alliances, the most important lesson of history is that we can succeed with such a realistic, no-regret strategy. In 1946, George Kennan correctly predicted that it might take decades to succeed with the Soviet Union. The US cannot contain China in the same way as it did the Soviet Union, but it can work with our democratic allies like Europe, Japan, and Korea to constrain China's choices by shaping the environment in which China rises. It's worth remembering that when you add together the economies of the democracies, the US, Europe, Japan, and others, they'll greatly exceed that of China and Russia added together. And that's likely to be true for the rest of this century. So if there are lessons of history from the stories that are circulating in Washington today that I've described, I think the most important lesson is to keep a sense of perspective, and particularly to make sure we don't sleepwalk into some sort of disaster. Now, as I said, I would like to add a little coda on what difference we've seen as a result of the events in Ukraine. I think there, China is obviously backed Ukraine. Xi Jinping seems to have extracted a promise from Putin not to launch an invasion before the Olympics were over, when Putin and Xi met in Beijing. And Putin certainly took no time after the Olympics were over to launch his invasion. China abstained from votes at the United Nations criticizing Russia, and it has refused, or thus far not come out with any open criticism. The interesting question is how far this will go in terms of Russian-Chinese relations. One idea that's been pushed about is that our tight or tough response to Russia in Ukraine is pushing Russia into China's arms, and that we're creating or recreating a bipolar world where you'll have the old Sino-Soviet bloc, now the Sino-Russia bloc, against the Western democratic bloc. But I think that's too quick an answer, too facile an answer. first of all, Russia has to worry about the fact that if it becomes too dependent upon China, it will be the junior partner. And that is a concern for Russia, which has a lot of empty real estate in Siberia, whereas China has a lot of extra people out in that region. So that there's a residual worry or suspicion in Russia about this. What we have in the Russia-China alliance is an alliance of convenience. And it was fine when it was used to basically reflect the annoyance that both China and Russia had with the United States, very much an alliance of convenience at the UN and other diplomatic forums. But in fact, by invading Ukraine, Putin has turned this into an alliance of inconvenience. For years, China's formal position, which it has used to try to attract other countries, has been to be absolutely firm about sovereignty. And Russia quite clearly has violated that. And if China is now being pressed by Russia to provide military equipment, which the New York Times reported today, then there's a prospect that China could get involved more deeply than it wishes to be. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, is reported in the press today to be flying to Europe to meet with Yang Jiechi, who's the top Chinese foreign policy official, and to warn him not to supply weapons or break the sanctions against Russia, or that could lead to secondary sanctions against China. This would be enormously expensive to China and to the US. But essentially, by warning China against this, Sullivan is trying to prevent a tightening of the China-Russia alliance, and he may or may not succeed. We'll have to see after reports come back from the effects of his visit. But the thing to keep in mind is that China and Russia have strong common interests in avoiding the dominance of the United States. They also have very different interests in how they want each to relate to the United States and how that relates to their visions of the future. As I mentioned, Putin, as the leader of a declining power, declining demographically and economically, has a greater incentive to take risks. And that's what he's done in Ukraine. Xi, as a rising power, has a greater incentive to play for the future, to hold off these type of very large risks. So the alliance of convenience may not turn into a full-fledged authoritarian bloc that some people are talking about. But in any case, we're at an extraordinarily interesting and important point in history, and predicting exactly how this will turn out is beyond the capacity that I have, or perhaps any others have. But I think it's certainly something we should be discussing in the light of this larger picture that I portrayed of how we should respond to China over the long run. My speech was aimed at thinking about a future out to 2049. This coda is aimed at thinking of the future out to the end of this week, but one can be very relevant to the other. So Linda, let me stop there and turn it open for people to have their own comments or questions.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, Joe. Well, we have one comment that was written in the chat some minutes ago, and it's from Richard Knox, and he wants to talk about nationalism. And he said, well, nationalism is sort of a two-sided coin. There's good nationalism and bad nationalism. Ukraine is an example of good nationalism. It's critical to the future of their democracy. But then again, in the hands of authoritarian leaders, nationalism can inflame populations and do bad things. So his question is there any way to promote one type of nationalism while avoiding the other?
Well, it's a great question that Dick Knox raises.
Yeah.
we're living in an age of nationalism. We Americans are nationalistic, but if it blinds you, if it makes you demonize the other, if you don't see the full importance of the other perspective, it can lead you into very mistaken strategies. And in that sense, my own personal view is that the more we have contacts with other people, the more we soften the roughest edges of nationalism. If I, for example, have over the years made a number of Russian friends, many of them don't agree with Putin at all. And one of the things that worries me a little bit about cutting these people off, and that includes cutting off social media, the internet, and so forth, is you lose this extra stream of information that tends to soften the So I think it's appropriate that we are putting strong sanctions on Russia. The danger is if we get to the point that we anathematize everything Russian and cut off all social contacts with everything Russian, we may miss one of the things that could help to soften or alleviate the Russians over time. So it's a difficult balance to face. And the problem is, yes, there is a real concern about nationalism, but we got to remember that we have our own nationalism, and it's when it gets too extreme that we run into blind spots, and blind spots can hurt us as well as our opponents.
Okay, Arthur's iPad, good old Art, has his hand raised. Matt, have we unmuted him? In which case,
he should be
go ahead, Art.
able to talk now.
Let's hear the question.
Yes, Joe, very interesting talk. I would like to add the dimension. It's in space. You've sort of neglected to speak of space. China's going to be a tremendous competitor there. And of course, we do an awful lot, though it's really tapered off in a current administration. But it's going to have a great effect, on the policies, back here on Earth. I'd like to make a comment after you respond on the Ukraine situation, but I'd like to have your response to that.
Well, I think you're exactly right about the importance of space. There are lots of things I didn't mention because Linda didn't want me to speak all afternoon. But for example, I didn't say anything about cyber either. So you're absolutely right on space. We have to figure out how do we enforce some rules of the road for space. I mean, people have talked about things like keep out zones for grappling satellites, or banning direct ascent explosive use against satellites, which can fill the space with dangerous debris and so forth. So there are lots of things that are important there. It's hard to reach agreements on these sorts of things, though, when you're locked in the midst of an active combat situation like we see now in Ukraine. But at some point, Ukraine will be over, and at that point, we should be thinking hard about rules of the road for both China and Russia and others in space and in cyberspace.
Okay, and relative to the Ukraine situation, we have really cut off all academic and science connections to Putin's country. And that is a big mistake. Even during the Cold War, we cooperated with Russia in space activities. Now we're demonized because of Putin. MIT's cut off their scientific endeavors with Russian scientists. We cut them off with any activity with cooperation in space with us. It's a very big mistake that we've been sort of bumbling through this situation over in the Ukraine, and it extends to other things like the no-fly zone. Well, even the generals have said they're using ground missiles to do most of that bombardment, and having aircraft up there isn't going to make a bit of difference, a no-fly zone. But it's really getting ready to precipitate a war if someone goofs up on the Polish border who seems satisfied to send the jets over there. We don't need those jets or the blood on our hands.
Well, I sympathize with your view on exchanges. I think we should be punishing oligarchs and people who are in the so-called siloviki, the inner circle. But cutting off scientific contacts or academic contacts or people-to-people contacts with Russians is not really in our interest.
Okay. A question from Bruce. How does the possession of nuclear weapons by both the declining and the rising powers affect the relevance of the Thucydides trap?
Well, the existence of nuclear weapons means that the world is different from 1914. I've sometimes used an analogy, a metaphor, saying that nuclear weapons are like a crystal ball. If you could have handed this crystal ball to the leaders in August of 1914 and say, look inside here and you'll see your empires dismembered and you've lost your thrones. Do you still want to go ahead with this war? I think they would have said no. And to some extent, nuclear weapons are like a crystal ball. They say, yes, there's a very powerful weapon, but look at the effects if you wind up using it. Do you still want to go to war? And that induces caution. On the other hand, the danger is that that crystal balls can be dropped or shattered. And in that sense, nuclear weapons have made a full-scale war less likely. I mean, Biden has said we're not going to get into World War III over this. On the other hand, there is always the prospect of accident or miscalculation. And I think what's happened is that Putin, as the weaker party in military and economic terms, is inclined to basically threaten with nuclear weapons as a way to improve his bargaining position with us. When he raised the nuclear alert last week in Russia, we wisely did not raise our nuclear alerts. But there's always some danger. So nuclear weapons indeed have had two contradictory effects. They've had the contradictory effect of making people more cautious, but also the prospect of an accident that could be beyond the calculations of the people who get into the situation.
All right. Phil Cunningham would like to know, how well prepared is our diplomatic corps to perceive and project U.S. interests vis-a-vis China? Is our diplomatic bench deep enough?
We have some really superb people in the State Department. I've worked with a number of them over the years. On the other hand, could we use more? Yes. I mean, Chinese language training and knowing that Chinese culture is, we could always use more people that way. On the other hand, I'm impressed by the quality of the people we do have. So the answer is, I guess, glass half full rather than half empty, but we could also fill the glass.
All right. Hang on. Bill Gerber wants to know, will the current heavy use of sanctions not drive China and Russia and perhaps others to seek to establish a currency different from the dollar as the predominant world currency?
That's a very important question. And the danger is that if we use sanctions too much or too often, others will try to clear more of their trade in currencies other than sanctions. But we're starting from a fairly strong position. If you ask what proportion world trade is cleared, or what proportion of world reserves are held in renminbi or Chinese currency, it's about 3%. And the US dollar is about 60 something percent. So to suddenly gin up another currency which has the trust and depth of markets of the dollar, it's very hard to do that in the short run. On the other hand, if we keep doing this with sanctions, others have a strong incentive to try to reduce their vulnerability. It's hard for China to become a reserve currency because they like to control their currency and to restrict its freedom by which it crosses borders. Also, China doesn't have the deep and flexible capital markets and institutions that the US does that back up the dollar. And perhaps one of the most important things, the dollar benefits from being under a rule of law, whereas China's renminbi is basically under rule of the Communist Party, not a rule of law. So I think the long-term question is a serious one. In the short term, I don't think it's going to make a difference.
Okay. John would like to know, one important factor in Russian underperformance in Ukraine has been the level of corruption and oligarchs in Russia. To what extent is this also true in China?
Well, it's an interesting point of comparison because both countries have enormous corruption, but the difference is that corruption in China has been accompanied by a booming economy. Corruption in Russia has been accompanied by a declining economy. And so in some ways, the corruption, I mean, Xi Jinping has made major efforts to stamp out corruption. This tends to be more punishing your enemies who are corrupt rather than really stamping it out. But it hasn't gotten in the way of a high rate of economic growth. In Russia, on the other hand, what they call the kleptocracy, which includes not just the oligarchs who took over the state-owned enterprises when the Soviet Union collapsed, but also the Silviki, who are the security people, the ex-KGB types who surround Putin and are themselves very corrupt. They have not been beneficial for Russian growth. So it's a fascinating comparison that, yes, both countries are corrupt, but the Russian corruption problem seems a lot worse.
Okay. Pardon. Hang on. New topic, Elizabeth Piquet. Another issue is the influence of the internal US environment on the international scene. In Europe, according to her, Europe sees Biden's statement that he would not send troops in order to reassure the US public, leading to being a direct cause of Putin's invading Ukraine. It's nice to reassure the public, but in this global environment, it sends the wrong message. With your extensive experience in international relations, what do you think about this?
Well, there's something in the point, which is that if you tell Putin that you're not going to send troops, that relieves him of a bit of the anxiety. And you have what, in the case of Ukraine, you have what might be called an asymmetry of interests. For Putin, Ukraine is a vital national interest. For the United States, Ukraine is a major but not vital national interest. However, if Putin were to go further and try to attack a NATO country, which we have guaranteed under Article 4, which we haven't done for Ukraine, that would start making the American defense a vital interest. And that's essentially why Biden has repeatedly said that we will regard an attack on any NATO country, which comes under Article 5, sorry, of the NATO agreement, we regard that as an attack on the US, and why we have sent troops to the Baltics and Poland and so forth, and why we have American troops participating with Norway now, an upcoming 30,000 troop exercise, NATO exercise. So does it make a difference if you say, I won't send troops or I will send troops? Clearly it does. On the other hand, if what Biden has been trying to get across is that he understands that there's an asymmetry of the interests. And if we send troops into Ukraine, the dangers of escalation, because Putin would have a stronger card to play in the bargaining, the dangers of escalation could lead you into a 1914 type situation. So it's a tough call, and Biden is trying to play it in a way which preserves NATO and helps Ukraine as much as possible in terms of weapons and money, but not American troops.
Okay, Henry is talking about in China, for many years, governance was carefully apportioned in China among several leaders. Lately, they've been vesting more and more power in a single individual. Is there a cautionary tale for the Chinese as they now witness the results of an unchecked autocrat engaging in a disastrous war? Will they think twice about vesting more power in a single individual?
Well, they should, but will they? I doubt. If you look at Deng Xiaoping, but he realized that when you have an autocratic regime, one of the hardest issues is succession, moving from one leader to another. And Deng arranged a framework in which a leader would only last for 10 years as head of the Communist Party. And then through the mechanisms of the inner circle of the party, a new leader would be designated, chosen, and you would have an orderly transition period. That seemed to work when they moved from Jiang Zemin to his successor, but it doesn't seem to have worked when you move to Xi Jinping, who wants to extend his rule. I think this is a big mistake on his part. On the other hand, you get this difference between what's the interest of the individual leader and what's the interest of his country. For Xi, he seems to put his own interests as continuing in power above the formula that Deng Xiaoping had created. I think it's a mistake.
Okay. Judy and Mike Alexander are asking, how effective have the sanctions on Russia been on affecting the lives of everyday Russians? Isn't the idea to get them to turn against Putin?
Well, the sanctions are of different types. The sanctions that punish the Russian economy as a whole punish both the oligarchs and the leaders, but they also punish the people. And so if you punish the people, for example, you've seen a 40% drop in the value of the ruble, your credit cards don't work anymore, and so forth. In principle, this should lead to demonstrations in the street which overthrow Putin. But that's not the way the system works. I mean, what you've seen is what thousands, tens of thousands of people locked up when they've demonstrated in the streets. And you've seen the closing down of the few remaining sources of adequate information, such as Echo Moscow and radio rain, television station rain. So I think if you had a model of a country where the public was more influential, that model would work. On the other hand, I think in the case of Russia, it only works if it punishes the people closest around Putin to the point where they try to get Putin to change his mind. There's not much inclination that that's having this effect yet. It might be that the battlefield losses, which show that the Russian military has been much less effective than it was reputed to be, may reach Putin sooner in terms of affecting his inner circle than the sanctions. But again, it'd be nice to see this as an uprising from below, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Gresh Lattimore would like to know, how does Ukraine inform the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Well, the situations are somewhat different in the sense that China regards Taiwan as not a case of another sovereign country. It regards Taiwan as part of sovereign China. So that is not that precedent of invading a sovereign country is not relevant. What's more relevant is the failure of the Russian military to carry out what they thought was going to be a smash and grab, a quick operation, deposing the existing regime and replacing it with a puppet and so forth. So I think the Chinese realized if the Russians couldn't do that with a contiguous force on land, it's going to be pretty hard for China to do it with an amphibious invasion.
Alex is asking, does the Chinese government view climate change as a serious problem? And if yes, how do they foresee solving this problem?
Well, the Chinese have taken some steps. They do realize that this is important to China. They have taken steps to put major investments into solar and wind, and they have made pledges, though who knows whether the pledges will be fulfilled, of reducing the carbon intensity of their economy by 2050 or so. But they also at the same time are burning a lot of coal and importing a lot of oil. So they're torn between their desire for a high rate of economic growth and the realization that burning that much carbon can hurt them in the long run.
Bill and Marion Bruins, can you imagine an off-ramp to divert Putin from his present path?
Well, the most interesting, one off-ramp would be if the people around him said, hey, you're doing more damage to us than we can tolerate, and they removed it. I mean, that happened to former Soviet leaders like Beria, Khrushchev, and so forth. But you don't have the same structure of power in those days with the Politburo in the Russians. But that's one off-ramp, is get rid of Putin. A more promising off-ramp would be if Xi Jinping were to say, I have a major opportunity here. I could play Teddy Roosevelt in 1903 or 4 and become the arbiter between Ukraine and Russia and win myself a Nobel Prize and Peace Prize. And that would have a big effect on the international diplomatic situation to China's advantage. I don't think he has the imagination to do it, but it would be an interesting off-ramp if he did. It would be accompanied by something like negotiations between Zelensky and Putin to say that Ukraine would be neutral and there'd be autonomy for the eastern provinces, and they might agree to disagree on the status of Crimea. So you'd have some sort of a negotiation, but it would be brokered by the Chinese. That off-ramp it strikes me as probably unlikely, because I don't think she has the courage to do it, but we'll see.
Very interesting. Getting back to the first possible off-ramp, getting rid of Putin, Gideon Ben-Horan wants to know, is there a case to be made for the immediate elimination of Putin by any means possible, rather than witness the ongoing death and destruction he wreaks on Ukraine and the world?
Well, I would dearly love the dear Lord to send Putin a heart attack, but I think the chances of getting it at the right time is difficult. If we set our objective as getting rid of Putin, then the question is, what's that do to the off ramp of trying to get Putin to negotiate with Zelensky and to pull his troops back? I mean, anything we can do which stops this slaughter of innocent Ukrainian civilians, we should be in favor of, ranging from the heart attack to the negotiation.
Glenn Bassett says, the level and the type of misinformation and outright lying by Putin seems unlike anything I've read about in history. Does this level of misinformation have any precedent? Does it matter? Or is what we're seeing just a modern instance of same old tactics? How does China's misinformation record and the USA's influence the Ukraine situation?
Well, both Russia and China control information. I don't think the Russian control of information today is worse than it was in the Soviet Union. It's as bad as it was. So to get accurate information is very difficult. The Chinese have been very restrictive on information as well. So a Chinese doesn't hear on the Chinese news about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's, Putin, if you say the word invasion in Russia, you can be sent to jail for 15 years. So we're in a period of very bad misinformation. But if you go back to the height of the Cold War, we've seen it before.
John Rudy asks, short and sweet, why not help Ukraine hit a Russian reactor?
Well, it's tempting in a sense of tit for tat, but you're not sure which way the winds blow. And sometimes the radioactivity can blow back on you. Also, I think at a larger point, we should be trying to discourage attacks on nuclear reactors simply because we're not sure of how we can manage the effects. So it's tempting to say, I'll do to you what you did to me, but sometimes it's better to turn the other cheek.
Jim Ramsey would like to know, how, in your opinion, will the Ukraine situation eventually work out? Will Russia wind up with the eastern parts of Ukraine, the whole country, or some other outcome?
Well, I don't know, and I don't think Vladimir Putin knows. I think what Putin has done is stimulated Ukrainian nationalism, and he has 200,000 troops to try to govern 44 million people. He can't do it with that number of troops. The fact that he's developed a deep resentment and hatred of Russia and Ukraine means the idea of Russia ruling Ukraine is very slim. So it may lead to, on a worst case analysis, to years of Russian efforts at control, whether it's of half of Ukraine or of all of Ukraine, and a bloody insurgency.
Doesn't sound very good, does it?
No.
No. Richard Knox, do you think the US can be successful in blocking other nations' assistance to Russia in this conflict?
Well, the most important, of course, is China, and that's what Jake Sullivan is over in Rome today trying to do, which is to dissuade the Chinese from getting involved in that way. The threat of secondary sanctions, which goes along with this preeminent role of the dollar in international affairs, is a pretty powerful form or weapon to discourage others breaking the sanctions.
We have a few more questions hanging on. How are you doing? Your energy level okay?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes, but why don't we see if we can wrap one or two
I
together?
think we have just a couple of questions, so I think the timing works out. Bruce would like to know, this is returning to the question about off-ramps. Is Ukraine's agreeing to neutrality and never joining NATO either a possible or likely off-ramp?
Well, it probably would be an element of the off-ramp that I described as a negotiated solution. I imagine that Zelensky's already hinted that he's not going to try to join NATO. And neutrality doesn't exclude his eventually being part of the European Economic Union. And I think the harder parts are going to be recognition of the Russian control of Ukraine and Luhansk and Donetsk. Those are, I think, tougher ones. But I think the neutrality and the NATO are probably ones that can be negotiated.
Phil Cunningham, can you comment? This is the first time we've had a question about Poland. How do you think people in Poland are viewing their own security situation?
Well, every report I've heard is that the Poles are very concerned. They're very worried. Ukraine is their neighbor. You've got to give the Poles credit for the way they've accepted so many Ukrainian refugees. And but the Poles have to worry that if this spills over, the Poles and the Baltics are the ones who are sort of right in the line of fire. So Poland is properly worried.
Okay, it looks like we have two more questions and that's it.
Okay.
How has Ukraine changed the calculus for China, Russia, and the US with regard to any deal with Iran?
Well, in the short run, it's been very unfortunate because the press account said that there was almost a deal on restoring the JCPOA, as the deal is called. And then the Russians pulled out of that because they wanted relief from sanctions as the price. And so, I guess it's probably going to take a change in the Russian position before you can get back to the negotiations on Iran. And who knows when that'll happen.
Well, our last question is from Anonymous, and it's not an easy question, but is there anything more that the US can do short of a no-fly zone to stop the reckless brutality of Russia?
Well, I think the diplomatic pressure on China to put pressure on Russia which might lead to some sort of a negotiation as an off-ramp is the thing that might have the best prospect in the near term. I mean, we can send more weapons, we can add more sanctions, but I think the key question is, how do we get Putin to stop the slaughter?
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have left for questions, because Joe is a busy man, and you've got places to go and things to do, I'm sure, right? No
Yeah.
Retirement for you.
You do.
Well, please accept our very warm thanks for coming back to us again. It was a marvelous presentation, and the numbers are huge. I think we broke an attendance record again, having you here. We love having you here, Joe, for that reason. Thank you, everybody, for being a wonderful audience. I hope we got all your questions addressed. Please come back again and join us next month. Join me again in thanking Joe Nye for an enlightening conversation. And we look forward to having you again in the future. This concludes our presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.